Iranian alliance meant to destroy America. Now, this becomes very pertinent to the propaganda we're seeing from people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and so on today. You see them supporting the Iranian regime and opposing the U.S.-Israel alliance against the Iranian regime, but this fits perfectly into Dugin's broad strategy to unite with the Islamic world, as he calls it, and Iran in particular, to destroy that Western snake that's crushing the land powers in the world island, which he thinks are destined, because of their massive land that he has, they are destined to rule the world. They just haven't been able to figure out how to get there yet.
Okay. I've got so many different angles I want to explore here. Welcome back, everyone, to the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast. Pastor Doug is on the road this week, so he will not be with us. I'm going to be flying solo. Well, I do have a wonderful guest, but just make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. Make sure that you are connected to us on Facebook with the Shoulder to Shoulder community. And make sure that you check out Israel365news.com for all your news and analysis from Israel from a biblical perspective. Make sure you check out my columns there. And please go over to Patreon and subscribe. Become a Patreon subscriber to this podcast. You can help support us. We do have some production costs, and it really does help us continue to do what we do. We're closing in on 5 years of the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast, and it's thanks to all of you that we've been able to do this. So go over to Patreon, and for your gift, for your support of $10 a month, you will gain access to an archive of Bible studies with myself and Pastor Doug, chapter by chapter Bible studies starting in Genesis 1. Each lesson's about 15, 20 minutes long. We go through a chapter of the Bible, share some insights, a pastor and a rabbi, kind of unique. And that's all for you, for helping support us in the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast. Well, I'm not gonna waste any more time. I want to get right into it. A very important topic here. I've been meaning to engage in this conversation. Dr. James Lindsay has been on the podcast before. He's no stranger to this audience. He's really one of the great I would call him a field general in the information warfare space that we have now. That's the best way I could describe it. He's someone who's really been fighting the good fight in many ways and has suffered for it, and has become in recent months a dear friend. And just welcome back to the podcast, James. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Well, as I said to you, I don't want to waste any time with our viewers, and I want to get right into the topic. I want to explain what we're talking about here. So with all of this might be a little bit of a long tee up just to frame the conversation, and then I'll give it over to you. But what we've seen over this last, year and a half or so, it's hard to say when exactly it began, with all of the rise of not only hatred of Israel coming from what's considered the conservative right or the podcast universe. We're talking about people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and some others, and my on-again, off-again associate Steve Bannon has gotten involved in this as well. But it's not only about Israel. There seems to be this decidedly down on America slant under the guise of being patriots and being America first and loving America. There's a lot of this. It almost sounds like, what the left does with the 1619 Project and criticizing the American origins. There's a lot of demonizing of America. And some of this takes the guise of rewriting the history of World War II and Churchill being the bad guy and Hitler being the good guy. And it's very difficult to make sense of all of this. And I don't know a lot about this topic, but I know from the little drips and drabs that I've had there that there is this Russian guy named Dugin, Alexander Dugin, who's some Russian political thinker who has had a great influence. I know that Tucker Carlson has a relationship with him and traveled to Russia and met with him. And that's a big piece of this whole world is this glorification of Vladimir Putin as part of the whole ethos of this strange movement. And I wanted to have you on because I know that you've been digging into this and you've been looking at it, and some of the tweets that I saw from you over the last few months, I thought you were the right person to talk to about this. So I'm going to just tee you up with that. It's not really a question, but could you explain to us what it is we're seeing here? And I think this is the right time to talk about it because I know Candace Owens is currently in Russia. Apparently she's visiting Dugin right now. And I just want to help us understand what we're seeing because there's been so much talk about this group, so much worry about the anti-Semitism on the right and the anti-Israel sentiment and this woke right, all the different terms that are for it. But you seem to be getting to the bottom of what it's all about.
Well, this is a big, big topic. just to throw this out there, and what Alexander Dugin is not a small part of the story, but he's not anything like the whole story. So I just kind of want to start by saying that. And Alexander Dugin's this interesting character because it's not at all clear how seriously he's taken in Russia. And I don't just mean by Russian citizens, I also mean by Russian serious political people such as Putin, or even the Russian military leaders who have been for some decades now educated on some of Dugin's ideas. It's not actually clear how seriously he's taken. But the thing is that he is being taken seriously in this particularly Russophilic segment of this more radical right, which also turns out to be anti-Israel, turns out to be anti-US in a very real way, anti-Trump, and kind of anti-everything that seems to be going right since Trump got reelected. And so Dugin's significant to them. Like you said, he's got some relationship with Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, when he went to Russia a couple of years ago, rather famously sat down and interviewed Alexander Dugin, thus introducing him on a very big scale to an American audience. But he's by no means the only one who's done that. There's a character that goes by a pseudonym called Aaron McIntyre, who works at The Blaze, which is a fairly substantial, right-wing conservative media outlet, and he's interviewed, or hosted, I should say, Dugin twice. He interviewed him once, and he hosted a discussion between Dugin and the radical right neo-reactionary named Nick Land, who has fairly crazy ideas. You can go back to the archives and look in early 2018, as far back as that, and see Richard Spencer and Nick Fuentes discussing Dugin and his ideas and the relevance to the alt-right as early as early 2018. And then, of course, when Steve Bannon, as you mentioned, got kicked out of the White House by President Trump in his first term, one of the first meetings that Bannon had was a day-long meeting with Dugin in Rome. And so this guy is this character that just kind of keeps popping in. And his philosophy is relevant, maybe not because of its relevance in Russia, but certainly because of his relevance to this radical alt-right, woke right, reactionary right, whatever we're calling this thing. And his philosophy is peculiar. This guy's a weirdo. We have to actually start with a judgmental term like weirdo. Previously, until recently, I had only read some of Dugin's essays. I had not read his books. I've started to read his books. I haven't finished either of his two primary works, which are called The Fourth Political Theory, and the other one is called The Foundations of Geopolitics. And that one is the one that the Russian military officers have been required to read for some time now, since the late 1990s. But I did read a couple of his essays, two very short essays that he wrote in the 1990s as well. One of those is called The Gnostic, where he positions himself as a purveyor of black magic, and he says that magic is the only type of true spirituality in the world, and you have two choices, white or black, and that black is the only way to truly make history. And he calls this path the Gnostic path, and he advocates for it unabashedly. So this is why I call him a weirdo.
Hold on, slow down. Hold on. Let me just I want to make sure that both me and my audience understand what you just said here. So you're saying this guy does not profess to be part of the Christian faith, even part of the Russian Orthodox Christian faith? I thought that he was part of the traditional Russian church. Yeah, and if you're saying that he is, how does this fit in? And if he isn't, back up and tell me more about this black magic.
All right, let's just go into you said the magic word there, pun intended. You said the magic word without realizing it, which you said the traditional Orthodox Church. As it turns out, as we've all learned dealing with woke for the last decade, sometimes words mean more than one thing. We're all used to this idea now that, somehow diversity and inclusion seem to have meant something different than what they seem to mean on their face, right? It obviously seems to mean getting radicals to take over an organization under a guise of something that looks like civil rights, but it does not mean actually caring about diversity because nobody's allowed to think differently, right? So we understand that words mean different things. There is an occult school of thought called traditionalism, usually spelled with a capital T, that is rooted on a guy named René Guénon. that basically none of us have ever talked about. I know very little about Guénon himself, but I know that Dugin is a capital T traditionalist, and he references Guénon all the time. Now, our mutual associate Steve Bannon is also listed on the traditionalist Wikipedia entry as a devotee of traditionalism. Now, what traditionalism is, it's like inverted New Age. I'm trying to think of a simple way to explain this philosophy. It's like New Age turned inside out and upside down. So New Age kind of has this idea that all the religions are touching on a truth, and we can kind of get airy-fairy and float above them, and the Jews say this, and the Muslims say that, and the Christians say that, and the Buddhists have this, and whatever, Om Namah Shivaya or whatever. And we can just kind of create this spiritual soup for a higher order level of thinking, and touch on what's ultimately called the perennial philosophy, that there's one deeper truth, this deeper religion that all the religions are just trying to articulate. So if we start looking across kind of pan-religiously at all the religions, rather than believing that any of them are uniquely true, we believe that all of them are approximations of the truth, and we rise above the religions to get to that perennial truth that's true for all people in all times and all places. And this is usually some kind of weird New Age, new thought sort of quasi-mystical spiritualist belief system where basically you get to do whatever you want.
That's the New Age thinking.
That's New Age. Yeah. So what would it look like if we turn that inside out and upside down? Rather than picking and choosing from every philosophy, we bore deeply into one. So we pick something, say, the Russian Orthodox Church, or we pick something, say, Shia Islam, and we dig down to the bottom. We dig deeper and deeper and deeper until we see through the particularism and realize that the same perennial philosophy comes out not by expanding above our religion, but by getting all the way down to its truest essential core. So it's like the opposite direction to get to the same place, which is that all the faiths of the world are actually true, but they manifest in different ways. And by boring into one specific tradition and being as maximally traditionalist in that tradition as you can possibly be, you unlock the secrets of the bigger, broader, universal truth of the whole world. So when he's a traditionalist Orthodox, Russian Orthodox guy, that's how this is meant. He believes that orthodoxy is a vehicle to a deeper, transcendent truth that exceeds Christianity or any other belief system. And he's openly said this, that Shia Islam does the same thing. So this is your Islam that the Islamic Republic of Iran peddles. That it is also one of these old grand traditions that if you dig all the way to the bottom and you come out the bottom side, you end up in the same place as everybody else that digs to the bottom of their true traditions. Now, Protestant Christianity would not be one of these things. This is considered to be this kind of modern invention. You would not be able to go traditionalist into Protestant Christianity, but Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Christianity, probably Confucianism and so on, but certainly also Shia Islam. I don't know what he thinks of Sunni Islam. You can dig down to the very bottom. And so his belief system is actually this kind of occultism that by focusing super intensely on one tradition, you end up transcending all tradition.
Okay, wait, before you go on to the black magic and how that fits in, does he define what that kind of universal core truth that you get to is? Does he say what the content of it is?
I haven't read any of his writings on perennialism specifically, and that would be a question about Guénon. And Guénon is on the horizon of things I haven't got to read yet. So I don't know, but I would bet you that it looks almost exactly the same as the New Age thing, is that we are all one, that certain traditional practices create mystical experiences that create union with God, that unveils to us that we actually are God, and so on and so forth, like they always do. This is how they all believe. So I don't know, but I bet that's what it is.
To any new idea then.
Well, certainly, yes. Absolute purity of a unique tradition, which therefore must not be contaminated by any outside idea whatsoever.
Okay. So where does the black magic fit in?
That's a good question. I just know that he wrote this essay calling himself a Gnostic and he says the sentence that like starts the essay is that there's only two paths to spirituality in the world, and the right-hand path and the left-hand path, white magic and black magic. And then he argues for the left-hand path or black magic the whole way. So this is why I would suggest that sort of Gnostic Luciferian concept is what he's going to bore into and come out the bottom of his religion or his tradition and find. But I don't know. He just advocates for this unabashedly in this kind of standalone essay that he wrote in 1997 and published in the National Bolshevik magazine that was circulating in Russia at the time. It's a very peculiar piece. And like I said, this is what I read previously from him was The Gnostic, and this other essay, which he calls Fascism, Borderless and Red, where he advocates that Russians need to adopt a Russian National Socialism that has red communist elements to it, but that transcends both fascism and communism and the errors of race that the Nazis put forth. But that's only about a 3-page essay. And I thought, wow, this guy is about as un-American as one can possibly be.
Explain that. What do you mean?
This idea that it's fundamentally the collective nature of mankind, that this national socialist idea that is what is necessary in the world, that liberalism, he says, is a failed experiment. Communism is a failed experiment. Fascism is a failed experiment. This is the essence of his book, The Fourth Political Theory. So we need a new theory, and that theory will be based off of fascism with communistic elements in order to create a new model that is designed explicitly to oppose the model that the Western world has used, and in particular the United States. So it'll be collectivist at its core. It will be fascistic, which means the intentional sacrifice of the individual for the state apparatus. That's the idolatry of fascism, is that the state subsumes all individual personalities, and so you are bound by duty and honor to devote your entire being to the well-being of the community, the folk, or the state. But it's not going to have these same characteristics, like I said, of Nazism or communism. But it must, he says, be red, and it must be borderless. It must not worry about national borders while it still retains that ethnic national character, which is kind of this paradox. And like I said, it's a 3-page essay, so I wish I could explain it better, but he doesn't give you a lot to go on. It's one of these, he's one of these writers that in his essays is very etheric, very, like, he doesn't finish ideas, and it's hard to follow. His books, however, seem to be the other way around. He seems to be very, very clear in these books, in particular, The Foundations of Geopolitics, which I think has kind of opened my eyes to the line of thinking that not just this new radical right here in America and also what's called the new right in Europe use, but this kind of Eurasianist model that explains why Russia is siding with Iran, why they're trying to create the BRICS alliance as an anti-Atlantic, anti-American project.
So talk about that. What are the underlying ideas that, that produce that?
This is unfortunate. It's like there's a lot to unpack, and then there's not much to say, if that makes any sense. When you run into something like that where he's occupying another world of thought, and once you kind of like lay out the ground rules, it doesn't really say anything. But so his concept of geopolitics, first of all, we have to understand, because what he means by geopolitics is not what you probably mean by that word. That word has a couple of meanings in the common use. There is a specialist use that he didn't invent. I'm not accusing him of inventing it, but there's a specialist use of this word that most people don't know. So the two common uses of the word geopolitics are kind of like what he calls world politics. So we're now concerned with nation against nation, the politics of, large regions. What are the concerns of the entire Middle East and what that means for, say, China? That's a geopolitical analysis, right? But that's not what he means. And then secondly, you might say, well, it's the politics related to, say, where are the minerals, where is the water, where are the ports, where are, navigable waterways. So geographical and geological politics. And that's closer to what he means, but it's still not what he means. And those are the two common parlance uses of the word geopolitics. What he means by geopolitics is a belief that the type of space that a country or a nation or a people occupy is determinative of who they are and what their destiny is. So in a sense, geography is destiny. So there are, in the big picture in this geopolitical school, two types of powers: land powers and sea powers. Russia, in the middle of the largest land-based country in the world, is the largest land power. America, along with Western Europe, pretty much just the NATO concept, but also the whole Mediterranean, are basically sea powers because they all have access to warm water ports, safe water ports that, say, Germany to a degree, but Russia in particular doesn't have great access to. And that these are fundamentally in a pitched conflict for world domination and control, and that because of their nature, they have fundamentally different values in the peoples that they produce. And this seems impossible to understand for a denizen of the 21st century because we have airplanes and we have safe, well-made ships. But if you go back about 300 years, you can kind of get an idea of like the deep mythology upon which this is based. Land-based, landlocked places like Center Russia, you probably, if you live there, you're probably not going to go anywhere else in your entire life. Transportation is difficult. All shipping is done by train or truck. But 300 years ago, there is no train or truck. So you're talking about like a wagon and trying to get across the land. It's very difficult. But if you're on a seacoast, like in Britain or in Spain, you can just load up a boat on the pier and just go sail, and you can be trading pepper with China, and you could be, harvesting potatoes in South America. You have an entirely different world. So this has created two different types of societies with two different types of values. So this isn't totally crazy. It's just sort of out of date. The landlocked idea, the land powers, which he calls tellurocracies. These are based in traditional values. They have to stay stable year after year after year. They are collectivist in their nature, in their organization, and they are ruled by a ruling ideology, whereas the sea powers are based in trade. So you have fluid values. If you're a seafaring Jew and you encounter seafaring Christians, you got to figure out a way to get along to trade. If you encounter Muslims, you got to figure a way to trade. It doesn't matter. Your values, therefore, are much less rooted. As a matter of fact, you start to hear stuff that sounds like the old anti-Semitic tropes, that the sea people are rootless, that they're rootless cosmopolitans who will sell out their values in order to make a dollar and to trade and make money. And so money becomes their God. I mean, all the anti-Semitic tropes get attached to the sea people, which he ends up identifying with the Atlantic Ocean, and thus Atlanticism as a philosophy. So that's NATO,
and Americans. America. I mean, there's no. Now I'm getting it, because if you just let me kind of paraphrase back some of what I'm hearing. If you see the world as a kind of in this black and white, this pitched battle between the traditional land-based collectivist societies versus these rootless, seafaring, more entrepreneurial, and if you translate that into ethics today, the rootless seafarers, like America's, who's more rootless than Americans? Americans, they don't even trace their identities back more than a couple centuries at most, and they're also very liberal in their social mores. So it can turn into a kind of cultural, moral struggle as well.
That's right.
Am I hearing you right?
You are hearing me exactly right. You have picked up exactly what Dugin's laying down. As I've articulated it, I think I've done so faithfully. And now the thing is, there's a moral element that gets thrown in, and then there's a power element. And he says explicitly that his worldview of geopolitics, as he calls it, it's a science and a worldview. It's not a way of analysis. It's a worldview that it has a moral component and a power component, so a political component. It is about power, and it is for power, he says. It's for which one of these two types of societies controls the world. Now, the moral element is that the land powers, not just are they rooted in that they have these long-standing traditional values that don't change much over time, but that they also are located in the pivot points of world history. Russia in particular, he has an entire part of his book that's about Russia's unique location in the world as the pivot point or the heartland of what's called the world island, which is that thing. So it's Europe, Asia, and Africa together is the world island. And the theory is whoever controls the world island controls the world. And so the belief right now is that Russia is the natural inheritor. It has the right values because it is the people that were on that land and developed them as the heartland of the world island of the world. And it's being crushed by the sea powers that have colonized all along the rim, whether they've taken over and brought in their values through the Mediterranean, whether they've done so through Europe and then wasted all of Western Eurasia, whether they've done so across India through the British colonies and through South Asia, through Southeast Asia, through the French and other colonies, that basically the Atlantic peoples have, and he calls this the anaconda strategy, have wrapped themselves around the land people like a snake and are squeezing it to death. And so the goal is to kill the snake. The goal is to destroy this Atlantic water-based, sea-based value system, as he sees it, so that Russia can rise again as the center of the world that it was always supposed to be, but it's never been able to achieve. And so it reads strongly to me as like a therapy for a humiliated people more than anything else. It's like a therapeutic ideology to say, Russia screwed up with the Soviet Union. It collapsed. It was not able to join the world capitalist, and it was humiliated, and it didn't want to join the world capitalist order because of its humiliation and anger. It got taken over by kleptocrats and oligarchs and all this wretched stuff. And it's good that way, and we're better anyway. And forget your world order. We're gonna break it. And it feels very much like that's his model. But it causes him to say that the other peoples who have these traditionalist values against the secular, rootless West should unify. So he has an entire portion where he talks very explicitly about how the Russian Islamic alliance should form and fight against the West, in particular with Iran. So a Russian-Iranian, and this isn't written back in the 50s or the 60s, this is written in the 90s. So there should be a Russian-Iranian alliance meant to destroy America. Now, this becomes very pertinent to the propaganda we're seeing from people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and so on today. You see them supporting the Iranian regime and opposing the U.S.-Israel alliance against the Iranian regime, but this fits perfectly into Dugin's broad strategy to unite with the Islamic world, as he calls it, and Iran in particular, to destroy that Western snake that's crushing the land powers in the world island, which he thinks are destined, because of their massive land that he has, they are destined to rule the world. They just haven't been able to figure out how to get there yet.
Okay. I've got so many different angles I want to explore here, because, the big question mark up until the last couple minutes of what you just said, and I think it's becoming clear to me now, is what is the attraction for Americans? And it was, why is someone like Tucker Carlson, who born and raised in the United States of America, why is he even attracted to it? Why are these ideas at all attractive to Americans is one question on my mind. And the alliance with with Iran, the alliance with the Islamic countries, seeing it as that they're also pushing back on these rootless, libertine, seafaring peoples, the American types, seeing them as fellow travelers and pushing back against them. I can see that. But I want to bring it back to what we're encountering now in America.
I'll add one piece before we do that, because
Go ahead.
Piece to his philosophy with this anaconda strategy that he's describing. The anaconda is what ultimately squeezed and killed the Soviet Union, which he actually argues whatever its forms that it takes, the land ideocracies of the Eurasian continent are always correct. So the Soviet Union was actually good. blah, blah, blah. But then it's crushed. And who he credits with having created the model that ends up, this anaconda model, this globalization of the Atlantic or the seafaring sea power model, is Henry Kissinger. So he starts talking about Henry Kissinger, the Council for Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, and saying that these are the actual institutions that were brought up to kind of finalize and globalize sea power. So now you can see why somebody like Tucker Carlson, who's been opposed to this, Kissinger-esque globalist program, would be seduced by this kind of philosophy, because Dugin's not completely wrong that these so-called mondialists, as he calls them, and it comes from the French word for monde, or the French word monde, which means world. So the globalists are the mondialists, and they have this idea that there's going to be one great big happy world, that everybody shares the same fundamental values, and everybody has their cute little cultures, but everybody's basically the same, and that they just have to project out there and squeeze out the people with the wrong value set, fundamental value sets, and then everybody will join the capitalist world order, everybody will become sea powers, and so on. And that this was Kissinger's vision, along with these globalist nonprofit entities that seem to be the kind of string pullers of the world. So what he's done is he's identified the globalist project with the sea power project. He says that they are one and the same. So now you get these people like Tucker Carlson who are rejecting the globalism, and they're more nationalist or nationist in their orientation. Nationalist usually are getting pulled into this Duginistic thinking. And then Dugin's providing a roadmap for subversion of that project in order to break it apart. But what he's also offering is the wrong solution, which is that basically Russia becomes the pivot point around which history now revolves, that the entire Eurasian continent is unified under a rigid ideology that's going to look something kind of like probably Chinese communism, but he doesn't say that, but that's probably in practice what it'll look like. It might be Islamic in nature or some weird mixture, but the point is that we've got to get this Atlantic power object out of the way first. And so these traditionalist kind of paleo-conservative and paleo-libertarians that we're seeing turn against Israel, blame Jews for everything, and so on, would be seduced by this line of thinking, because it's criticizing the right thing for some of the right reasons while offering the wrong solution set.
Right. So, okay, let me just paraphrase back to you, make sure I got what you're saying. So there's legitimate disdain that we have for the globalist project, for sure. And especially in the post-COVID era, where there was a real sense of this globalist apparatus that was suppressing our freedoms and suppressing our traditional identities, for sure. And the left-wing wokeism and the trans culture and all of that was also viewed by people were trying to retreat to tradition. They wanted to push back against it. And you put all of this together, and it seems that these Duginite ideas were able to capitalize on those legitimate sentiments and just run with them. And then you end up with people saying, well, I want to reject all of the globalism and all the rootless cosmopolitanism, AKA the Jews, and it all becomes one soup. And then what I'm also hearing is like echoes of, when Tucker Carlson constantly echoes this idea, which is it's so false, it's so easy to disprove, that the only reason that there's hostility from the Muslim world towards the West is because we've intervened in their affairs and because we've squeezed them. Which, if you're Putin and you say, hey, NATO promised not to expand and now they keep expanding, you can see where the paranoia legitimately could come from. NATO did expand beyond what they said they would, but conflating that with interventionism in the Arab world and saying the only reason that the Arabs hate us is because we've meddled in their affairs. And why have we meddled in their affairs? It's all for Israel. So you can see where the dominoes fall, and this all becomes a very attractive ideology and animating the woke right. But where it ends up is being on the side of Putin and Iran and hating America. And the question is then, for young Americans who are being pulled in by this, is there a point at which they look at themselves in the mirror and go, "Oh my gosh, where have I ended up?" I mean, like, how does this end up looking?
I mean, that's the hope, is that we can get these young Americans who've been pulled into this to have that moment. And what you said, by the way, about NATO, this is actually, again, this was written in the 90s, but this is actually on the list of anxieties about Russia and its futures that Dugin is writing down. He's talking about the expansion of the Western alliance from Western Europe through Central Europe, moving even in toward Russia to foil from the West any Eurasian continental ideas, from Vladivostok to Dublin as one Eurasian continent is the vision, right? And so now you have this threat from the West, and then you have the Islamic threat that the Islamists are not going to leave these kind of southern provinces alone. They're going to try to move into those. And then that you have the Chinese are not going to leave their eastern end alone. So Russia has this anxiety expressed here that it's going to lose. It's supposed to be the world pivot, and it's going to lose what it has as its gigantic landmass, as its primary thing that it has to offer to the world, because Russia, the Eurasian continent, can only be an autarky, as he says. It can only manage its own affairs internally if Russia is an integral part of that Eurasian program. So that's his vision. Now, what do you see, though, and what can we tell our young friends here that hopefully gets them to look in the mirror and say, my goodness, what am I helping? What am I hurting? So what are the kind of two things in the world, if I'm thinking about it, what are the two things in the world that actually articulate a fundamentally different vision to this Duginistic Russian, I don't know, it's like a salve for humiliation, for national humiliation after the Soviet Union? Well, it's simple. It's the United States of America under President Trump, with his Trump doctrine, which is anti-globalist, but also it is not this what he calls multipolar world where we're just going to leave Eurasia to become its own separate superpower. But at the same time, it's also the U.S.-Israel alliance. The U.S.-Israel alliance answers the question of, what does this sea power alliance look like where Western Europe is now faltering? And all of a sudden you see another sea power that's injecting itself into the exact heart of the so-called world island, Israel, that is thriving, successful, able to defend itself, and is in fact defending itself against this so-called traditionalist, occultist worldview that Dugin assigns also to the Shia. And so here you have a royal threat to this entire ambition to make Russia become the world pivot again, and to build a Eurasian continent that's unified under something like BRICS or the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative or whatever it happens to be. And that threat is the dual threat of President Trump's anti-globalist but not multipolar doctrine, and the alliance that facilitates making this work that the United States has with Israel. And so those are the two things we see attacked most vigorously. President Trump and his ability to execute his vision at this crucial moment in history when we're trying to stave off this woke attempted revolution, and simultaneously the alliance that the United States has with Israel, which has at this point never been more productive, never been more likely to bring security and prosperity and safety to the world than it is now, that is challenging Iran and taking out terrorist cells on a scale that's never been accomplished before. The war on terror, as it was said, didn't really accomplish most of its goals. It wasn't able to go to basically the nerve centers that made the terrorists work, and now you have this U.S.-Israel alliance that is actually dismantling the terror, the centerpieces of the terror fortress, or whatever, Iran in particular, as the chief sponsor for the last 50 years. So this thing, the the Trump doctrine plus the U.S.-Israel alliance with the Trump doctrine is the scariest thing in the entire universe to these multipolarists who are under the Dugin doctrine. And so they have their U.S. propagandists who have bought into this philosophy for whatever set of reasons: money, the spell of inevitability, the world's changing, there's nothing we can do about it, it'll be good for you if you help us, but it'll be bad if you don't, that kind of thing. Or blackmail or whatever other untoward possibilities. Or maybe they're just ideologically committed. Who knows? Maybe Tucker's just an ideologue. Who knows? But Trump and the U.S.-Israel alliance are the two things that scare them most, and they're the two things that those people attack the most viciously, the most consistently. And hopefully our young people can realize, holy crap, the propagandists that I've been listening to for the last few years, that I came to trust through the COVID years and afterwards, have been now leading me into the exact opposite of what needs to happen in order to protect the world from basically a Chinese-dominated 21st century.
And it's so interesting that so much of this crowd in the U.S. especially is gravitating towards Orthodox Christianity and pre-Vatican II traditional, Catholicism, because as much as in the Bible, in the text of the Bible, the power flows from the individual. The individual is created in the image of God. Even the appointment of a king depends on the people desiring it and the consent of the governed. Each individual owns their plot of land granted to them by God. No human being rules over us. God is the liberator. He liberates us from collectivism and from Egypt, meaning the majesty of the individual, the sovereignty of the individual is very much a biblical concept, and it was a biblical innovation in the ancient world. And Protestant and Catholicism, traditional Catholicism, was much more of a kind of power structure. But then Protestantism, the whole revolution of Protestantism was really bringing the Bible back to the individual after the printing press, and individuals could have their direct relationship with salvation, and they don't need these intermediaries and priests, etc. And the whole ethos of America is built on that individuality, which is still very front and center also in Jewish thinking. And it makes me think that there's a spiritual component here, that there's a kind of common worldview, even if it's not a common theology, between both Islam, atheist communism, and this Duginism, which are all very much like your individuality is subsumed into the nation or the ideology is more important than the individual, the sovereignty of the individual, and the sovereignty of the individual can even seem quite libertine. It can seem quite quite dangerous to these people. So it seems to me that there's a spiritual component here.
There is.
It runs very deep.
As a Jew, you're going to get to laugh at what I say in a moment. But so I'll start by saying, let's look at this from the angle of kind of their, geopolitical, as it's called, perspective, this Duginist perspective. First of all, he names individualism itself as one of the wrong values of the sea power people. That
really,
because you are able to be an entrepreneur, he names you mentioned entrepreneurship earlier without me prompting it. Entrepreneurship is the completely wrong value. It is the centerpiece wrong value. So the sea people have
used it as
for
a
him,
negative.
for Dugin.
Wow.
So you get to be an entrepreneur, you get to do what you want, there's going to be protected property rights, and then the individual is the most, he says the individual is the most mobile part of the group, therefore is the most exalted. So individualism is in fact the corrosive acid that breaks down this values-based land power mentality. It is the problem. Secularism and individualism are the problems. Okay, now, so what do we have, though, in the West? We actually do have a spiritual crisis here. We have a deep spiritual crisis. And this is how the Duginists are able to capitalize on yet another piece of what's happening. I'm not one of these kind of strong, I'm a weak replacement hypothesis person. The replacement hypothesis is that woke was a replacement religion because the traditional religions fell away. I believe that is a weak explanation, but not irrelevant, right? So some people think that's the whole story. We lost Jesus, now we're woke. And it's I don't think that's true. But we have been, and I'm going to use a fancy word here, we have a very deeply deracinated population. We've been pulled up from our roots. We don't know what our spiritual roots are the way that we used to. We don't know what our national roots are, especially as Americans. We've been subjected to now 50 plus years of what I'm referring to just in general as critical America theory. Critical theory started to target American culture and American values, whether it was through race, whether it was through sexuality or sex, whether it didn't matter, or whether it's
just not knowing American history.
Yeah, just trashing American history. You're not allowed to just be proud of being an American and be proud of our history. You have to say, oh, well, we live on stolen land and all that. And you just aren't allowed to be, right? So here we have people who don't know how to feel proud of being who they are as Americans. They don't know their history very well. They don't know their spiritual history. Now, I'm not going to put Protestants on blast, but there is a difference here between what's called the high church and the low church, right? So the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church are high church models. The church is a big structure. It's a solid institution. It's very organized. It actually has a core doctrine that goes beyond sola scriptura. So
and it has tradition.
And it has traditions. That's right. Deep traditions going back 1,500 plus years, depending on how we want to date things. Okay. Now, Protestantism is low church. Every man is a pastor. If you can read the Bible, you have your direct relationship. Therefore, every man is a pastor, and it frequently feels that way. Churches are sometimes, in strip malls. They don't have that art, that gravitas of a cathedral. There is no very strict robed hierarchy where the guy in the black robes answers to the guy in the purple robes, answers to the guy in the red robes, answers to the guy in the white robe. They don't have this. And then again, the tradition is really thin, right? The tradition is very, very thin. And then it's not just because the Reformation dates back to the 1500s. The tradition is very thin because there's so many denominations and people trying to actually grapple with scripture and find out what's theologically true. And it just feels like a low church instead of a high church. And this is a very big problem for deracinated people. Young people who grow up without roots look for roots. And so the roots, one of the easiest ways to find roots, and this is where you get to laugh as a Jew talking about Christians, is that the oldest religions that they know to identify with are Catholicism and Orthodoxy, right? And of course, there's, even Romans, the book of Romans talks about a deeper root that they might turn to and respect, but that seems to be a bit of a problem for some of these people. But they're desperately looking for patriarchal structure, tradition, and that sense of everything in their lives. Think about your average young person who's grown up under woke nonsense their entire lives now. They don't have, you and I are old enough where we had a foot in the not woke world that we grew up and got our grounding in. Well, they grew up, everything's woke, everything's sand, everything's water, if you want to use the Dugin language, and churning around them. They have no solid ground. They're looking to just connect to something solid, old, unchanging, and uncorrupted. Now, there's a huge irony there as well when you get to church, structures, but they see older equals less corruption. The tradition of 1,500 or 2,000 years, all the way back to the throne of Peter with no aberration, means they got as close to the source in Jesus as you could possibly be and still be Christian. And it's a long, uncorrupted tradition because it's allegedly in their minds the same tradition, and they're craving that rootedness. And along comes the Duginist philosophy and sells this idea of the West is rootless. It's a water-based society. Everything is up for grabs. There are no values. It rejects tradition. It's entrepreneurial and individual. It's not group. It's not collective. No traditions can hold. It's everything wrong with the world. And this is exactly the propaganda you see on RT, the exact propaganda you see that the Russian state media portrays with come to Russia commercials, and exactly the stuff that comes out of Tucker Carlson's mouth, Candace Owens' mouth, and on down the line with these influencers.
Wow.
Taking advantage of rootless young people to suck them into an ideology that's actually destructive and against their interests, because it satisfies a craving that they have because what they're dealing with is so torn up. That's right. It's a totally legitimate craving.
And that's the thing. That's where I think this conversation has been so helpful. And I think really gets to the bottom of a lot of this, because a lot of the conversations about these people are about the symptoms. And I think that we've really touched on some of the problems here. We've touched on the real issues here. That to sum it up in one bumper sticker slogan, this whole thing is an extreme backlash to the decades of the postmodern moral relativism, breakdown of the family, breakdown of tradition, beating up on your American heritage, that whole witch's brew that these young people have been raised in. That this is what the backlash looks like. Mm-hmm. This is what it looks like, and it feeds right in to the reductionist version of the existential need that they have right now in this current moment in time. Wow, I think we've really gotten to the bottom of a lot of this. This conversation has been even more enlightening than I imagined.
Well, you reached out at the right time, and it's key to understand that Russian propaganda tends not to create problems, but to exploit existing problems. So it read the writing on the wall in this deracinated postmodern West and served up an answer that's absolute poison. And so, of course, now the radical right, or whatever this, Duginist, they have a least favorite hyphenated word ever, and we get to find out the answer is that hyphenated word that they hate, which is Judeo-Christian. The Judeo-Christian value set are the roots that people are looking for. But I'm going to add another hyphen because we can make it even worse, which is the Judeo-Christian American system is like a trifecta of orienting your life around humility and around hard work, willingness to endure in order to obtain a good result, of honoring the individual and his capacity to bring light or value into the world. And so the set of values that kind of gets enshrined in the American founding, that is very strongly Judeo-Christian, but in a uniquely American way. So Judeo-Christian American, an even bigger, hyphenated monster they won't like, is actually the answer. It's just allowing people, helping people, young people in particular, to understand what that means, why it's important, why it is their actual heritage as Americans, or as Israelis even have a strong touch of this, the Judeo part at least, and the why this even alliance between America and Israel is so fundamental, not just from a practical perspective, but in this philosophical way as well. Like when you read John Winthrop writing in 1630 for the Massachusetts Bay Colony in his famous meditation on the shining city on the hill, where he's quoting from Jesus to say the shining city on the hill. But what does he say is that his hope and his prayer for the Massachusetts Bay Colony in Boston and in America overall as a colonial project is that it will be faithful such that the Lord, or the God of Israel, comes to dwell among us. And we'll know that it is true because a small number of us will be able to resist a large number of enemies, and we'll become a shining city and a light to the rest of the world, because we've kept our end of the covenant, and therefore the God of Israel will be pleased to dwell with us. So this is his prayer for the United States in 1630. So our roots, this Judeo-Christian American fundamental orientation, and teaching people that this is valuable, that there is tons of pride to be had in subscribing to this, to getting behind this, and to seeing yourself in light of this without having to have these gross apologies about stolen land and whatever else. I think this is actually the remedy, and it's it's like the prophylaxis, or the antidote to the seductions of things like Duginism or wokeism or communism or National Socialism, as kind of these flailing attempts to feel something like dignity in who you are, that's been robbed from you because your roots have been cut out from under you. So I think there's even a path to a solution here.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, Dr. James Lindsay, we're going to have to leave it there. This has been an incredible conversation. I really, I think it's one that a lot of our listeners are going to want to listen to more than once to make sure they picked up on everything. And from what it sounds like, you're doing a lot of reading. I can imagine that there's going to be some writing coming out of your pen on this topic, really getting to the bottom of what is going on here. And I just can't wait to see, and be a part of further conversations on this topic. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out today. It was a perfect time. This is all fresh on my mind. It's really important. So you couldn't have done a better timing.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us in Shoulder to Shoulder. Next week, I sure hope that Pastor Doug will be back with us. As you know, he's traveling the country with his family, talking about Israel, fighting back against those who are trying to demonize Christian Zionism and Israel in general. So Pastor Doug is out there fighting the good fight. Thank you for listening once again to Shoulder to Shoulder. God bless.